Night streets blur past in blue and orange, sirens echo against concrete, and somewhere between a punchline and a gunshot, the truth slips out of frame. Late in the 80s and 90s, action movies were supposed to be simple. A chase, a fight, a one-liner, the good guys walking away while everything behind them burns. But in the rush to entertain, something else got captured on the negative. Real exhaustion in an actor's eyes. Real risk in a stunt that went too far. Real tension between stars and studios when commerce tried to tame chaos. On paper, these films were just product. A bounty hunter and his target on the road. A pair of identical brothers out for revenge. Underground fighters bleeding for glory. A reluctant hero dragged into someone else's war. A seasoned cop forced back into a world that no longer plays by the same rules. But in the editing rooms, executives argued, scenes vanished, tones shifted, and the stories that survived were only half of what was really shot. Tonight, we are not just watching the movies. We are watching what they tried to hide inside them. These are the 5 films that revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. Film 1: Midnight Run, 1988. It begins with a chase, but not the kind the studio expected. On the surface, Midnight Run is loud, frantic, and funny, a mismatched duo barreling across America while every gun, badge, and syndicate tries to corner them. But behind the rolling jokes and asphalt heat, the real story was far from comedic. Robert De Niro stepped into the role with the seriousness he brought to crime dramas, expecting grit, danger, and sharp edges. Charles Grodin, by contrast, built the performance on restraint, silence, and the smallest movements of doubt across his face. The production believed the contrast would be electric. It was, but not in the way they understood. De Niro demanded long takes and authentic tension. Grodin asked for quieter scenes the studio thought were unnecessary. Directors looked for balance. Executives pushed for pace. The movie that premiered was the version that leaned into humor and chase rhythms, but early cuts, the ones that insiders whispered about, painted a very different film. Something closer to a melancholy character study about 2 men who only understand themselves when trapped together. There were disagreements, reshoots, and moments of friction that never made it into press junkets. Cameras kept rolling even when tempers flared, and some of the most human reactions in the final cut came from scenes where the line between acting and irritation blurred. By the end, the film survived as a beloved action comedy, but in the frames just outside the audience's view, there remains the ghost of a version that tried to be heavier, quieter, and more unforgiving. Film 2: Double Impact, 1991. 2 brothers, 2 continents, and 1 truth buried under the flashiest martial arts packaging of the early 90s. Double Impact was sold as a spectacle, Jean-Claude Van Damme playing twins separated at birth, reuniting to avenge their parents, trading kicks and one-liners while neon Hong Kong glows behind them. But what the audience never saw was how chaotic the production became the moment the cameras stopped rolling. Van Damme was not just the star, he was the writer, the creative engine, and in many scenes, the final authority. That power shaped everything, from dialogue rhythms to the length of fights the studio quietly wanted to shorten. Early drafts were darker, more brutal, and more emotionally fractured. Chad and Alex were not meant to mirror each other in style, but to clash in tone, one brooding, one violent, both broken in specific ways the producers feared would make the film harder to market. Reports from set described sequences shot twice, one version leaning into psychological tension, the other into broad charm that would play better internationally. When financiers argued for clarity over complexity, whole layers of personality were trimmed, leaving only the most commercial pieces intact. Scenes set in Hong Kong's underbelly originally carried a heavier weight, fewer jokes, more quiet hatred, but the studio preferred colorful energy over shadows. Even the climactic battle in the shipyard was altered. Earlier edits suggested a more tragic, slow-burn confrontation before the final explosion. Driven cut replaced it. The finished film became a cult classic. But inside its assembly lies a stranger, more conflicted story, one where the twins weren't just reflections of each other, but reflections of what the film once tried to be before it was simplified in the editing bay. Film 3: Bloodsport, 1988. It was the movie that launched an icon, and the movie that almost didn't exist in the form the world knows. On screen, Bloodsport is a legend forged in sweat and dimly lit alleys, a mythic tournament where fighters disappear into an underground world ruled by honor, pain, and spectacle. But behind the film that turned Jean-Claude Van Damme into an international name lies a production held together by stubbornness, improvisation, and a studio that nearly buried the project before anyone knew what it was. Early cuts shocked executives, and not in a good way. Pacing felt uneven, fights lingered too long, and character arcs vanished inside raw, handheld angles. Canon Films considered shelving the movie, convinced it lacked structure. Van Damme, still unknown, refused to let it die. In a move that became industry folklore, he re-edited large portions of the film himself, reshaping the rhythm of each fight, adjusting the timing of every strike, and carving an emotional through-line the studio hadn't seen. His version became the one that tested well, saving the film from near erasure. Then there were the parts no promo ever mentioned. Injuries on set that slowed production. Tension between directors and choreographers when realism clashed with spectacle. The inspiration story behind Frank Dux, once promoted as truth, later questioned, leaving the movie suspended between fact and fabrication. Even the iconic Chong Li fight had a darker original tone, fewer cheers, more dread before the studio brightened the ending to make the triumph cleaner, safer, easier to sell. What survived was a film that defined a generation of martial arts cinema. What remained hidden was how close it came to being rewritten, recut, or quietly shelved, another victim of a system that never trusted what it did not fully understand. Film 4 Rapid Fire, 1992. It was meant to be Brandon Lee's arrival, a breakout moment where charm, precision, and on-screen fury would finally merge into the kind of action stardom Hollywood had been waiting to market. But Rapid Fire carries a different story in its shadows. On the surface, it is a fast, explosive thriller about a college student caught between rival crime factions, forced to fight his way through corruption he never asked to unravel. Yet beneath the quick cuts and neon violence lies a production defined by rewriting, reshaping, and redirecting a film that never stopped changing even as it was being shot. The earliest script drafts were quieter, more introspective, exploring a young man haunted by his father's past and unsure of his place between cultures. Brandon Lee wanted layers still action-driven, but anchored in identity and conflict far deeper than what the studio believed audiences wanted. Executives, desperate for a star who could replicate the energy of early 90s martial arts cinema, pushed for spectacle over introspection. Entire pages were reworked overnight. Subplots vanished. Scenes that originally explored trauma became scenes that highlighted fists and firepower instead. Then came the conflicts in style. Directors aimed for a grounded tone, but second-unit teams shot action sequences with over-the-top energy the main story wasn't built to hold. In the editing room, these two visions collided. Some of Brandon Lee's most restrained performances were cut short to make room for faster pacing, while several longer fight beats praised by crew for their precision were trimmed to fit a wider theatrical strategy. What emerged was a film that thrilled audiences but betrayed hints of a richer internal struggle. In the frames left behind, you can still sense the version Lee fought for. A more complex portrait of a young man navigating legacy and danger, overshadowed by a studio that couldn't decide whether it wanted a thinker, a fighter, or both. Film 5, Lethal Weapon, 41998. By the late 90s, the Lethal Weapon franchise had already carved its place into action history. What no one outside the studio walls knew was how violently the fourth film shifted shape while it was being made. Lethal Weapon 4 arrived with expectation, star power, and a deadline that allowed no time for clarity. Cameras rolled before a finished script existed. Scenes were shot, rewritten, then shot again, stitched together from pages that changed by the hour. What audiences saw was chaos disguised as confidence. What the production lived through was a battle against a story that kept slipping out of the filmmakers' hands. Mel Gibson and Danny Glover returned with the weight of their characters' histories, but even they were navigating a plot that shifted beneath their feet. Jet Li, in his first major American role, delivered a presence so sharp that early storylines were rebuilt around him. His scenes were originally smaller, quieter, a ghost in the margins, until the studio realized the intensity he brought to every frame. Entire action sequences were expanded, reimagined, or created from nothing to capitalize on his impact. Behind the scenes, the tone fractured. Some writers pushed for a darker, more reflective film about aging warriors facing a world that had moved on without them. Others argued for comedy, brightness, and the safe rhythms of a franchise finale. The result was a patchwork, thrilling, funny, and frantic. But beneath it lies the outline of a very different movie. One in which Riggs confronts mortality with more silence than sarcasm, and Murtaugh grapples with responsibility instead of punchlines. In the edit bay, the studio softened the edges. Dramatic beats were trimmed, philosophical moments cut, and action took precedence over reflection. The finished film became a hit, but inside the footage that never reached theaters is a version weighed down by gravity, uncertainty, and the uncomfortable truth of heroes facing the end of their era. Bonus fact: the film that never stopped changing even after it was finished. Long before audiences ever saw a frame, some films begin their lives as contradictions. Hard Target, 1993, stands as one of the clearest examples of a movie that was never allowed to be the movie it was meant to be. On the surface, it is a stylish hunt-and-survive thriller, a collision of John Woo's operatic action language and Hollywood's demand for something safer, cleaner, easier to categorize. Beneath that surface lies a constant tug-of-war between a director who wanted poetry and violence and a studio terrified of anything that didn't look like a conventional hit. Woo delivered a cut filled with slow-burn tension, shadow-heavy frames, and a lead performance from Van Damme that leaned more into wounded resolve than invincible bravado. Executives pushed back instantly. They wanted speed, not silence. Firepower, not lingering glances. They trimmed scenes that stretched character, softened brutality, and questioned whether American audiences would accept the director's trademark symbolism. Entire sequences were recut by different editors, each pass moving the film closer to a shape that no longer resembled the one its director envisioned. The final theatrical version was a compromise, thrilling, memorable, and commercially successful, but far from the version Woo fought for. What few people outside the production realized was how many hands touched the negative, how many tones it carried before the last edit, and how many pieces were tucked away, never to surface again. Some films bend under pressure. Others fracture. And then there are films like Hard Target, suspended between two visions, surviving only as the shard that remained once studio demands finally stopped the blade. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail. Across these 5 films, the truth hides not in the explosions or the chase scenes, but in the spaces where intention and interference collide. Midnight Run carried the weight of 2 performances that were never meant to fit neatly together. Double Impact revealed how ambition and market pressure can shape a story in ways no script ever predicted. Bloodsport survived only because someone refused to let it disappear into a vault. Rapid Fire showed the quiet conflict between a rising star's vision and a studio's fear of complexity. And Lethal Weapon 4, built on the shoulders of a legacy, fought to hold its identity while everything around it shifted like wet cement. When placed side by side, these films form a map of the hidden forces that shape what audiences believe is effortless entertainment. Edits made in panic, scenes rewritten at dawn, tones softened to avoid risk. Every frame you see on screen is also a record of decisions made in shadows. The version released to the world is only one possibility. Dozens of others live quietly in unused footage, abandoned outlines, and memories held by the people who tried to tell a different story. So here is the question that lingers long after the credits fade. If the films we know are only half the truth, how many masterpieces were left behind in the cuts no one was allowed to keep? And how many stories have we celebrated without ever knowing the versions that were taken from them? Real secrets, where the truth was always in the edit.